Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, the Highland Park Conservative Temple.
No, you are not in Island Park, New Jersey.
I'm in Anshe Chesed right now. I'm in New York City with my good friend Rabbi
and
Jeremy
immigrants.
Kolonovsky. And we're doing this on in situ, on site. This is an on-site visit. Poor Rabbi Barry Chesler is in Long Island at the Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island. We're sorry that you couldn't be with us. I just came here to
An aborted business meeting.
board a business.
But you
Throw
know,
my white
okay,
shirt.
so
Yeah.
listen, guys, to our many listeners, we're only giving you two screens today, but it's the same
It's
price.
the same price for two screens. We are, first of all, so thankful for our many, many dozens of listeners and watchers, most of them on Barry Chesler's YouTube or Barry Chesler's
Facebook.
Facebook.
Facebook page.
I have a couple on the YouTube. You got people coming
On the Anshe Chesed
on there.
page, yeah.
So thank you so much. We are so delighted and honored that you spend about a half an hour with us every week, and it's great. It's great to be with you. Starting a new book this week. This is Parshat Bemidbar, first Parsha in the book of Bemidbar. Uh, I would say at the outset, this is not the most interesting Parsha. I want to say it's an amazing Parsha, but you know,
Everything's amazing in
I
its own
think our
way.
contract requires that you do.
But
okay,
this is
so
amazing in
it
its
is
own
an
way.
amazing parsha. If you like numbers, if you like data, and if you like to watch certain things, and that is to say, the way data tells a story and statistics tell a story, and we've studied this parsha in the past, with an eye to the various populations of the different tribes, and I think that tells a story. I have a theory that a lot of this information was probably sacred information that was passed generation to generation, the way that information does get passed down through song. That why would anybody want to possess this? Because this has the ancestral knowledge, and these numbers are probably symbolic numbers, but maybe not. Who knows?
Well, there are two other possibilities to consider. One is that they're based on court records, and that the numbers reflect a different period of time than the wilderness period, which is what they're attached to. But the other thing you were talking about the significance of the numbers. Another thing that's very significant that maybe another time is worth spending time on is the names. Jacob Milgram
Yeah.
writes a lot about what the names mean and how much information we can tease out by how the names are constructed.
I agree with you, and we've talked about this in the past where, the names of the tribes are such, and the names of the tribal leaders, Eliasaph ben Deuel, these are, the names of the tribal chieftains, and they reflect a different kind of style. I would say the same way that, here we are, we're Barry, Jeremy, and Elliot. Okay, so anyone who has just a slight knowledge of North American Jewish history could say just by our very first names, guess in what decades we were born. But our children, all have basically Hebraic names, and that reflects a social history of certain styles and trends. We didn't name our kids with Yiddish names or like Sprinza and Cyril and other kinds of names like that. Beryl. We named our kids, Yaakov, Nama, Mayan, Elisheva.
Yedidia,
Yedid-
Hadass,
Right?
Yeshayahu,
Good,
Odalia.
good biblical names, right? Elisa.
Rafi Galit, which is not a biblical name,
Okay, it's a modern Hebrew name. Okay, and so that says that
and
anybody
I
who
should add
served
Aliza Navi,
Well,
just to
don't
mention the
never
rest of
forget
them.
Avi and
exactly. So
Raphael.
so we would know just by looking at our family trees what where our kids are, what generations are, and what our proclivities are as Jews, because it was important to us. Not every Jewish family chooses these Hebraic names or biblical names. They choose, uh, I don't want to make fun of anybody's
No,
name.
no,
So
we do have to. It is very fascinating. Actually, I've got a bris tomorrow. Very connected Jewish family, and the child has got a beautiful Hebrew name. I'm not sure if they're planning a different English name, but like a real Hebrew name of depth. And it's interesting to me when people, like you said about the Yiddish names, you know, when when you know, call somebody up to the Torah and says, my father's name was Yusel.
Yosel, right?
No, I'm like, it's Yosef. No,
Yosel.
it's Yusel. And I just had an Oprah. This was, by the way, an interesting story also on the generational elements. Last week, there's a young woman who's getting married. Her English name, she has a Hebrew name for her English name, but it's not her Hebrew name. But her fiance, this is a great story. He's converting. In fact, they had the Oprah. His conversion's not complete. That's going to happen next week, and the wedding the week after that. But this is when they came back to New York for the Oprah, and he's from Venezuela and came to the United States and met her and got involved in Judaism. His paternal grandfather was a Hungarian Jew who escaped Hungary to go to Venezuela, and so though he really did not grow up as Jewish, he did have this piece of identity in his past, and ultimately is being brought back into the bosom of this ancestral family, which is pretty amazing.
Great story.
The names are really interesting. At least one of them seems like a joke. Pagiel ben Ochran.
Yeah.
God attacked me, son of troublemaker, or something like that. I just happened upon God, son of troublemaker. But I do think that the names tell a story in a profound way. I think that numbers are a little bit hard going as a way to tell a story. And I do think that our own American culture, by the way, is kind of a quantity culture over a quality culture. And I think that it's sort of at our peril that we let our numbers tell our stories, which I don't think is a great way of evaluating a society. I would prefer to be a qualitative kind of society than a quantitative one.
Well, if you're planning an economy, or you're planning an army, or you're trying to organize people, you need numbers. You just need that, and you need to know how you're going to distribute resources and what will happen, later on in the distribution of land. Although all the different tribes are supposed to get equal allotments, when it comes to land allotment and the geographical disparities in the land of Israel, it's very complicated. Look, these numbers tell us also about different families. Toldotam lemishpechotam leveit avotam. That phrase, it's such a great phrase. Toldotam lemishpechotam leveit avotam. It really tells you Toldotam is their generation, lemishpechotam to their families, leveit avotam to their ancestral clan, heads of clans. And it tells you a little bit about the way that families, that societies organize themselves. Look, we don't organize ourselves in that way at all anymore. We have, I think we're very lucky because we have communities. We have communities where, I'm presently located in Anshe Chesed, a great community, a fantastic community in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I'm from the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation, a fantastic community in Highland Park, New Jersey, where people make their decisions. They enter the community based on a voluntary association, and the community really defines their identity. And in antiquity, that just wasn't the case. Your identity was formed by who you're born to, who's your bet av, who's your mishpacha, your family, and who's your tribe, basically. And
because there was less movement than there is today.
Yeah.
Right? People were more rooted to the land, and today that's not the case. What's interesting to me is the number of people who live in different cities than the ones that they grew up in.
Every one
That's
of
a
us.
relatively new phenomenon.
Yes.
Right? If you go back 100 years, our ancestors were probably in those countries for hundreds of years.
Exactly. Look,
this is quite true. If you went back, let's say 200 years ago, I would say most Jews, there must have been some process of urbanization, but I would say that, from the countryside into the towns or cities or whatever. But I would bet that with a little bit of a wide net, 200 years ago, virtually every Jew lived in the place where their ancestors had lived for centuries, and today there's except for all those people. I'm eighth generation Yerushalmi or something like that, which is at least one of their strands. Virtually nobody lives where their ancestors lived.
It's interesting.
So much
I have
movement.
I have a few people in the congregation who grew up in Highland Park, and who they're about fourth generation. That you can't get much more than the fourth generation now.
I mean, you do find, of course, people who who've been in the Upper West Side for a long time. But again, like that's maximum, and there's been a lot of movement in between there. What you were saying about the rootedness in the land and the clans. It's only if you take that into consideration that there's any sense in one of the most beloved stories of Benot Tzlofchad, right? The daughters of Tzlofchad, who Tzlofchad is a guy. He dies. He has no male heirs. He has only female heirs, and the land gets parceled out male only. And the daughters complain and say, "Well, what gives? Should our father did nothing wrong, or he did one thing wrong, but he was not." Midrashically speaking, he wasn't one of the Korach rebels, and he died, for what he did, but because they can't imagine somebody would die except as punishment. But why should he be ruled out of an inheritance among the Jewish people? Because he's got no male heirs, because he's had 5 daughters.
Yeah.
So Moshe asks God. God says, "You're right," and so the daughters can inherit in the absence of male heirs, but then the other people in what's the tribe? It's
Menashe.
it's who?
Menashe.
Ben Chefer ben Menashe. They say, well, then if you marry men from outside the tribe, then the men will take our Menashite land. So you have to marry Menashite people, so the land stays in the clan of Menashe, the super clan of Menashe. And that story makes sense only if A, you assume that the land has been from the outset distributed fairly, and B, that people really, really care about keeping the land in the clan.
Wow. So look, I mean, I was thinking of as we're speaking. Growing up, I grew up in Ottawa, Ontario, and many of my peers still live in Ottawa and have their children in Ottawa, that's I think unique. That is not the pattern. The pattern is people migrate all over, and that's, as you point out, is very, very different from biblical civilization and pre-modern civilization, all pre-modern civilizations. So, okay, so we have this parsha with all the numbers, all the tribes, and all this, lovely, rich data here, and then we get to a point at the end of chapter 3 where I think it arises out of a problem, and we could discuss what the problem is, where Moses is told to, first of all, the Levites are not included in the general census. They are going to be counted separately. And then Moses says, this is chapter 3, verse 40, God says to Moses, "Pekod kol bechor zachar livnei Yisrael," count all the firstborn of the Israelite people from the age of 1 month up. Make a list, take the Levites for me, the Lord, in every place, in place of every firstborn. Okay, so it's in Hebrew, "Lakachta et haleviim li," take the Levites, tachat kol bechor, substitute the Levites for all firstborn, and on and on and on it goes with the firstborn animals. But basically, it's like this: we're taking a cohort of firstborn who have a special status. The firstborn are accorded a special status to serve and to be holy, to be sanctified. We saw that in the book of Exodus. Kadesh li kol bechor. We wear it in our tefillin. You are to sanctify all firstborn for me. And here, God is saying, I don't want the firstborn anymore. Put them aside. Let's take the Levites, count up the Levites, and count up the firstborn, basically. And so we're gonna engage in a trade. And what happens is, conveniently, and of course it is convenient, there are 22,000 Levites. That's the census of the Levites is 22,000, and there are 22,273 firstborn. So you have an excess of 273 firstborn over the Levites. So if you're going to trade the firstborns for the Levites, and now make the Levites, as it were, the holy echelon of the people, as the Bechor, the firstborn, were. You have 273 extra firstborns that need to redeem themselves. They need to buy themselves out of this. They need to pay a kind of redemption price, because imagine you're lined up. You got 22,000 Levites, and you got 22,273 firstborn. You pair them out, and you got 273 extra. So in the simplest reading of this, the last 273 in the line, they have to dig into their pockets and pay 5 shekels. The 5 shekels go to the coin, and that acts as a redemption. It buys them out of their role, and it's a I guess it would be a kind of technical consideration that exempts them from the role that was placed upon them by God. And so they leave the scene, and what we have then is the Levites become established as the officiants of the whole ritual cult apparatus, and the firstborn go back to their families. And I when I teach this, I taught this earlier this week, I want to say I like this. I like this idea that we put the firstborn back in their families, and we don't purloin the firstborn into the sacred structure. For one
So why do
reason
you think
alone.
that is, though?
I'll tell you
Oh.
what. Here's the reason that appeals to me the most, okay? Because how to I don't want to use any vernacular here. I'll just use clean language, which is, how do you ruin the family system? You ruin a family system by taking the firstborn out of the family system and putting that firstborn into this kind of another system. I'd say it's ruining it. Of course, I'm open to a counter idea, which would be that's an honor. It's a great honor. Go ahead, Barry.
Well, I think there's a little more going on than that. I think that what it represents in part is the level of development in society, is that the priest originally was not a full-time job. It's something you did in addition to other things that you did, in my understanding, and that at a certain point you need a professional priesthood, and you also need some kind of cohesion. If the priests are coming from all sorts of different families, it's kind of a melting pot, which, as we know from our experience in America, is not always so successful. It's better from an organizational point of view to have a guild, such as the Levites, that pass on their traditions from one generation to the next. And they're better able to keep those traditions because it's all part of the family lore.
I want to just make a couple of points here. Of course, it's going to be our predisposition to explain why something is good and makes sense, as opposed to seems often doesn't make sense. But there are problems that come either way here. So I think that at some level, in certain biblical stories make more sense if you assume that firstborns have a leadership role, and that includes a kind of priesthood role. And so, for example, when Shmuel becomes dedicated as a priest to the Lord, he's not a Kohen family, and yet because he is the firstborn of Hannah, who has waited for a child so much that she dedicates him to serve in the temple. That makes more sense if you think that at some level the firstborns always have that leadership role. And the biblical story, one of the Bible's most beloved stories over and over again, and is here, I think, exemplified, is that firstborns, the powerful looking, the seemingly born to leadership kind of people, end up disappointing you with their moral failings. We know this in our lives, that, like people who are kind of assume power tend not to be so sensitive to the needs of others. They tend to be more selfish or whatever. And so the Bible seems to like to tell a story that Esav gets supplanted by Yaakov, who's really leadership material, and David's older brothers get supplanted because even though they're better looking and bigger and stronger, gets supplanted by somebody who is more leadership material. And so I think that something is going on like that here, that the Levites, by dint of talent, something about the Levite character, are going to have that spiritual leadership rather than the firstborn, some of whom might be, pushy, arrogant jerks because they're the tallest. Now, on the other hand, Barry, you talked about the pluses that come with an organized, professionalized leadership. It's true. And, there are perks that come with this job, and there are tithes and masrot and gifts that go to the Kohanim from the animal sacrifices. You could imagine that in addition to the pluses, there's like a resentment if a certain family, everybody in Am Yisrael owes parts of their animals to Moshe's family. What gives with that? So, isn't somebody going to ask about why your family gets?
What's the prerogative?
I want to ask you, by the way, you focus on the very correct point that in this religion, organizationally, structurally, you cannot have your sanctity removed just by saying so. You need to do some action. You need to transfer some sort of ritual or dedicatory action. And so, as you said, like the 5 slaim become necessary to buy your way out. Wait a minute. We just read at the end of last week's parsha, at the end of the book of Vayikra, which this is now confusing me, we think of 5 slaim as a redemption amount because we associate it with Pidyon Haben, but that's for a 30-day-old baby. An adult male has a 50 shekel redemption. So it's now this is not the same thing because those are voluntary vows. You pledge your you pledge your value to the temple, so that is for an adult male a 50 shekel commitment. But we are talking here about adult males who are pledged to the temple, who need somehow to be. It's not the exact same thing as the value of a vow, but it just struck me as a slightly dissonant note that this is a rather not. Because I was thinking about, is this a really expensive thing or a nominal thing? Is that you redeem your temple status, you extra 273 firstborn with $1 a piece, or is it $10,000 a piece? Like I think 50 shkalim is an expensive fee, and 5 shkalim is not such an expensive.
Well,
fee.
it's 11 grams. A shekel is 11 grams of silver, and it's not a lot, but you can imagine that not everyone is walking around with
an extra 5 slime in their pocket.
With 50 grams of silver.
Well, partly because they don't have pockets, but that's another story.
All right. So I like the idea of the Levites being a family, and that, when you think about it anthropologically, here we are, we're 3 rabbis, we have rabbinic families, and so, our kids who know each other, they do have a language. They have a language that they share based on the fact that we're all rabbis, and this is not lay language. This is not, they know what it's like to live in this world of being, part of a community, or at least, serving a community. And they also know a certain level of privilege in the sense that, the focus was on them and all of that. So there is a microculture in the service family. I make the point, when of like these I don't know if it exists so much in New York City, but certainly in Montreal and certainly in Toronto, where the funeral homes are run by families. Mm-hmm. Were they run by families here in New York? I don't think
of course.
So. Were they?
Guttermans, I.J. Morris.
The Guttermans and the music hands must be a family.
Family, okay. But it only lasts to
and the Amsterdam Chapel, that must be a family too.
It can't go beyond a certain generation. In fact, businesses also, there's a lot of study in this as to how well businesses transfer to the next generation. It's very rare, actually, that you'll have multi-generational, generate beyond the 3rd or 4th generation, because by the 3rd generation, these businesses kind of.
There was a book written about Southern Jewry. What was the name of the guy? Eli Evans.
Yeah.
He wrote a book about Southern Jewry I don't really remember very much about it, but I remember this one exceptional line. He said, the story of Southern Jewry is the story of men who worked hard to build businesses to give to sons who didn't want them. It's
Yeah.
because they wanted to go to college and they wanted to become, somebody's an itinerant peddler. Somebody else, his child opens up a department store, and his child goes to law school, and his child becomes a professor of sociology.
Right. No, no. You're very lucky if your child or your grandchild or your great grandchild goes into the business. I was telling my class about Gold's horseradish. Okay, so it's a New York company, family company, and they're lucky that in the third generation, I think, there's one of the kids in the third generation who is so interested in the business, and she is taking over the business for that it's passing down, and also learn the skills of the business as a kid, and then got some education, etc. And those, who is it? Labenthal, the bonds, the municipal bonds. We're Labenthals. We sell municipal bonds. We know. I've been selling bonds since I was 12 years old. Like.
I don't know. But in the course of this, I'm realizing one thing about the Levite system, which this is purely a guess, but it stands to. I think it stands to reason. I bet this has something to do with literacy.
Yeah.
That obviously, we have even if when I say literacy, even if it doesn't mean that you decipher a set of symbols on a surface, although it will obviously come to mean that at a certain point, but to be masters of an extensive book tradition. What's this? There's a pasuk in Malachi. It's in a haftarah somewhere. Siftei kohen yishmeru dad v'torah yivakshu mipihu ki malach Adonai tzavaotu. The lips of the priest will guard knowledge, and you shall seek instruction from him, for he is God's messenger. The lips of the priest guard knowledge, because probably your average person certainly didn't know the sacred texts and whatever method they were transmitted by, whether it's purely oral or it also had some literacy component. It's certainly in the way that Barry was saying before, that some of the pluses of having a professional class is this could be a professional class of educators and scholars, and that's pretty important in Judaism.
There's also one element of the firstborn, which is that it had to do with nature, paganism, firstborn ancestor worship, that the firstborn of families were the ones entrusted with these kinds of roles. And I think that what the Torah is doing here is saying, we don't want that. We don't want any of that.
Well, it's interesting, Ellie, because we have rituals of first fruits,
Yeah.
and firstborn animals have to be redeemed as well. So it seems to be pervasive in the biblical mind how important the firstborn is. But reacting to something that Jeremy had said earlier, both Eli the priest and Shmuel Hanavi give evidence to the problems with both the family tradition and the firstborn tradition, because the next generation of Eli, his two sons, were found wanting, as were Shmuel's. And so it suggests
and we don't
that it's endemic to human nature, and you go with one system because it's just easier, socially speaking, even though there are problems with both.
It's also true, by the way, Moshe has children, but we don't hear about Moshe's children as leaders. And Aaron has children, and Eleazar, of course, does become the priest. But his first two children also go down in flames, quite literally. So I think that
I think the expression is up in flames with them.
They go up in flames, but I do think there's a basic ambivalence with inherited leadership and earned leadership. What will be called later in Chassidut, where obviously there's a lot of dynastic stuff in children, but in Chassidut they talk about yichus atzmo, your lineage of yourself. It's like your talent, your hard work. That makes a big difference.
Wow. There's so much to think about. I just want to end with one notion about trading, and that when I think about trading one person for another person, my mind goes to sports, where trades are part of sport, and you're always. I mean, we used to trade cards, but in the real world, they trade. People from one team to another team, and every sport has this, and some trades really work out, and some trades don't work out, and what makes a trade work in sports?
Well, sometimes you have partly because these exceptional professional athletes, they are incredibly hard workers, they're incredibly competitive, and they have been the just had attention lavished on them since they were 7 years old, and a lot of them are prima donnas, and they get mad and they need to change the scenery and they demand a trade. So sometimes trades work because a superstar, like a current thing that's on the table is that Giannis Antetokounmpo of the Milwaukee Bucks, he just wants out, and that happens all the time. Players, they just want out. It's one of the best players in the NBA. James Harden he's had to been traded a gazillion times because he doesn't play that well in the sandbox with others. On the court he does, in the team he doesn't. But since we're talking here about we're recording this during the NBA playoffs, and New York Knickerbockers are
the NHL playoffs.
There's another playoffs? The Canadians are still in it,
They
right?
are still in it.
Yeah.
God bless. They're amazing. They're playing amazing. Go ahead.
But the New York Knickerbockers are now in the conference finals again for the second year in a row. And there was a trade a couple years ago. Karl Anthony Towns came from Minnesota, and Julius Randle went from the Knicks to Minnesota. I think there was another guy there, but I don't remember right now. But both of those players are really thriving and contributing to their teams, and they sort of filled a gap that each of those teams had in the roster. They're both big guys and physical guys, but the cocktail of the team and what it offered was enhanced when Randall went to Minnesota and Towns came to New York.
I just remember watching Montreal Canadiens, and they had a strategy. I think it was Scotty Bowman, the general manager, and the coach. They would trade off older players for first-round draft picks, and that way they would continually build their team. And the trades are strategic, and if we want to focus back on the Torah here, there's a strategic goal here in the trade to get a group of people who have some kind of family characteristic, call it zeal or call it whatever. These are the Levites have already demonstrated themselves at the Golden Calf episode, and also way back even in the book of Genesis. These are people that need to have their zeal channeled, and so they get channeled into the service of God. They become the echelon that runs the ritual thing. It's efficient to do that. It doesn't disrupt families. It doesn't have a pinky toe in paganism. And this way, we still give them the second aliyah to this day.
We don't do Kohen Levi aliyahs, but that's okay.
You guys,
It's okay.
We still do. And
so when I come to your show, I want the first aliyah.
You got it. Yeah. You got it. Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together, and we are so grateful again for you having spent the time with us. Thank you for joining us. And from all of us, see you next week in the next edition of Parasha Talk. Bye-bye.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.